me just change my screens. And can everybody see my? Darrell, can you see my?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so it's Tuesday, and Tuesday means it's the Policy Leadership Academy, and this is for Best Start Region 5. And we are super excited that this is Module 9. And so I can't believe it, but we have been together now for 2 months and a week now for March 1st. So super excited. And today we are so lucky, so fortunate to have with us Danielle Johnson, who is going to be speaking on the topic of managing diversity. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to ask my colleague Darrell to introduce our speaker today.
All right. Danielle Johnson lives by the mantra, think, speak, and act for yourself and your community. Danielle is the executive director of Wichita Habitat for Humanity and my majority owner of Inclusive Growth Strategies, a diversity, inclusion, and equity consulting business. She prides herself on being an affordable housing advocate, conversation catalyst, inclusion and diversity educator, community mobilizer, and super volunteer. Danielle is a product of USD 259 Public Schools, a two-time Wichita State University shocker with a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in public administration. Danielle is no stranger to board committee and community service, as she currently serves on the following boards: Community Operations Recovery Empowerment, Inc., or CORE, Wichita Urban Professionals, Rise Up for Youth, Wichita Brand NAACP, Health Corps Clinic, and Leadership Wichita. Danielle has taken courses with Advanced Kansas Classes 5, Kansas Leadership Center, Young Professionals of Wichita Leadership Academy, and Leadership Wichita. Danielle and her spouse, District 1 Councilman Brandon Johnson, are the proud parents of 3 children, ages 17, 8, and 3. Danielle has extensive nonprofit and community engagement experience. Danielle sees the importance of representation and pushes to move the needle in the space she's in. Ultimately, what drives Danielle is her passion for our community as a whole, without ever forgetting what community is made up of: individuals coming together. Introducing Miss Danielle Johnson.
Thank you so much. It's kind of awkward when someone reads your bio, because it's like, ooh, just cut through all that, right? Because that only tells you a snippet of who someone is. So thank you so much for the invite and me being able to be in this space with you all. Not too long ago, I had the amazing opportunity to do some implicit bias work. So it's nice to be invited back as a Wichitan, a Kansan, if you will, born and raised right out of the middle of the United States. So I'm excited to be able to engage with you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please let me know if you can't see something or if you can't hear me. There's nothing worse than going on and on and on and no one heard a thing you said. So I have this up on the screen, and we're going to talk a little bit about everything. I know that this has really been a policy institution for you all. And so I want to make sure that I'm talking about how diversity, inclusion, and equity actually intersect with policy and then anything in between. So if you all have questions, please don't hesitate. I like to be a little bit more informal. I know that when we are more conversational, folks feel like they can really learn something and walk away with those pieces. So my hope is that you all feel free to ask any questions. I welcome pushback as well, right? I'm not here to just talk at you, but how do we co-collaborate in this space and co-create this space. So like it was said before, my name is Danielle Johnson, and I like to go by being referred to as a conversation catalyst. And you're probably like, what does that even mean? So I'm going to break that down on what I mean by that. So a catalyst is an event or person that causes great change. Kansas Leadership Center right here in Wichita, there is a great CEO and a director of that space. His name is Ed O'Malley. And he has shared with folks the importance of being a catalyst in conversations. And I believe that diversity and inclusion and equity work is very much that. And I had been asked alongside with a colleague to share some diversity and inclusion equity work on a call, and he affectionately called us conversation catalyst. And so I've been running with that name ever since, because I think, you know, there's something about being able to provide that great change, particularly in this lane. So feel free to call yourselves conversation catalysts as you all move forward. You can feel free to borrow that language. As we move forward, I believe in being able to set some engagement guidelines, because there'll be some conversations in small breakout groups and in the larger groups. So my hope is that we are open for engagement this evening. And so in this space that we're co-creating, just some guidelines for your consideration, and feel free to take these as well as you're continuing to have the dialogue. The work happens after we log off today, right? Oftentimes we're in places and spaces where we're energized. We went to conferences, we went to a training and we loved it in the moment, and then we threw it out the window the next day, right? A week later, you lose that energy, you lose those connections, and you forget about those amazing tenets, pearls of wisdoms you were taught. So my hope is that you all continue the dialogue after this, because that's when the most important part of the work actually begins. So as a catalyst, I do reserve the right to halt the discussion and maintain order. I don't think that's going to happen this evening. I've been in a number of conversations. There have been so many things that have happened over the last 2 years. But what's been really great is that everyone has maintained a respect level. Well, we might not agree. We can agree to disagree, but we've been respectful in doing so. So I look forward to a respectful dialogue. Embrace being reflective. There may be moments where I ask a rhetorical question. I'm just providing some knowledge, but I want you to really reflect on where you're at with some of the information I'm sharing. Does it make sense for you and your organization? How does it show up for you personally or in your familial life? So really embrace being reflective during this time frame. Wait, why am I talking? Why am I not talking? For those of us that are a little bit more introverted, sometimes you might need a little bit more time to process. I ask that you lean into the conversation a little bit more and feel like you have the space to be able to share it. Those of us that talk a lot, my talkative brothers and sisters, wait, just wait a moment, right? Because sometimes we will take up a whole dialogue and we're having a whole conversation. We're monologuing while we should be having discussion. So I ask that you wait just a moment, but I believe we're an intimate of enough group to be able to hear from everyone that would like to chime in. One mic, so obviously one person speak at a time, but don't feel like you have to raise your hand, just unmute and we'll go from there. And land the plane, which is one of my personal favorites. Everyone comes from a different lens. Everyone has different language. What we know is that language ebbs and flows and has evolved. So use the language that you have. Say your comment, say your statement, just land the plane, ask the question, because we're going to utilize this as a learning space. And when you're utilizing a space as a learning space, there's room for grace. But also be open for correction, or if a piece has changed, or if I say, you know, that language isn't actually used currently, and this is why it's offensive, please be open to that. Recorded. So please just land the plane. And when you land that plane, we want to assume good intent. It's easy to label someone racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, sick, sexist. I have no shortage of terms to throw out. I'm sure you all could add to the list. However, we're going to assume good intent in this conversation for a more robust dialogue. Also remembering that freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence. That's a basic human right, right, in our great United States. However, that there are not consequences to the things that we say. An apology goes a long way. And, you know, I'm willing and open to learn something a little bit different. How do you talk about things culturally, right? Asking those questions. We want to give grace, but we also want to be mindful that our intent and our impact are two different things. You might have intended to say something a certain way, but it impacted the person listening in another way. So how are we open to that dialogue? Stories stay and lessons leave. My hope is that you all get comfortable enough to be vulnerable and share some of your missteps or your successes. And in doing so, we don't want to share any of those stories out of this space as gossip, but an opportunity to learn from the principles that I know we can learn from one another today. Lean into discomfort with grace. Sometimes we're in places and spaces where people look like us, sound like us, echo chambers, if you will. Social media is a really good space to be in, to block and mute people, right? But how often are we leaning into that place of learning and discomfort, going against, not going against our values, but being open to the values of others? How are we in that space? And then last but not least, I've said this already, continue the dialogue with others. It makes no sense for us to have this conversation this evening and you not take what you learn and spread the gospel, right? Some folks are already D&I experts, so I may be preaching to the choir here, but the choir has to practice too, so that they can get up there on Sunday as well as they can. So my hope is that if there are some choir members in here, you're open to hearing this information again, and we're going to practice together this evening. Anything that you all would like to add to make this conversation a little bit more comfortable? Or are there any guidelines that you would like to share? No. And really, I do that so I can take some of your guidelines and add them to my sheet. So I'll let you all keep your guidelines for this evening. On a scale of 1 to 5, so with a show of fingers or in the chat, 1 to 5, how comfortable are you in diversity and inclusion equity topics? Scale 1 to 5, 1 being, you know, I'm signed up because I'm here for the academy, not very comfortable in leaning into conversations like this, or 5, Tracy, why didn't you have me speak at the front of the room? Because I do this all day, every day. So 1 to 5, where do you fall? Just like to kind of get a good idea of who my 1s and 5s are. Okay, so lots of in-betweens, lots of 4s, thank you. Okay, so we have a good spread of folks this evening. Awesome. How many of you all, oh, and actually I will also add, for those of you that can, and if you're comfortable doing so, I would like to ask you to join us on camera. If you can and are in a space and comfortable to do so, I would ask that you join us on camera so that we are able to see each other. I know we're in a Zoom world, but it is important for us to be able to read body language and faces. So I ask that if you can and you're in a place and space to do so, join us on camera. If not, I also understand and look forward to continuing to engage with you all this evening. How many of you all practice meditation or mindfulness? Show of hands or in the chat. Meditation, mindfulness. Okay, so we have a couple of folks that do. You know, oftentimes we hear that mindfulness and meditation is some new trend, and it's actually from some of our earliest ancestors. The art of meditation and mindfulness has been passed down year after year after year. And I think it's important, generations, right? And it's important for us to understand what it means to be still and planted and grounded. Right now, you probably could have a million things going on, particularly if you're Zooming from home or late at work. In this environment, we are used to 2 and 3 screens up. If you're like me, a laptop, a cell phone, you're a caregiver, so kids are in the background. You have family, animals, cats walking across the screen. I ask if, as much as possible, if you could mitigate some of those things. You have additional things up on your screen. I ask that you stop emailing. I ask that you stop texting, maybe getting off your Apple Watches, all the contraptions that there are, and be as present in this time frame as possible so that we all can engage as best as possible. So we will move forward with that. If you want to just take a couple of deep breaths, I'm not going to take us through a whole breathing exercise, although I could. We'll just do a couple of deep breaths, get as comfortable as you can, get your snacks and your water, and I ask that you be as present in this hour and a half, 2 hours that we have this evening. So thank you for indulging that long intro. I just want to be able to set the tone and create as comfortable as a space as possible. And I am reading some of the notes in here. I understand if folks do have to keep their cameras off, no worries, only if you can and if you're comfortable. Not all of us have the privilege to be on camera, and I want to make sure that I share that as well. So thank you for those that do have the space to be able to do so. So our session outline for this evening, just so we're all on target and you know what we're doing, we're going to do a little bit of engagement. So you'll actually go into a breakout room here pretty soon just to have some dialogue. I ask that you do have that conversation and that you're answering the questions and you engage with your colleagues on the screen, please. We're going to review some common language because I am going to be talking about some diversity and inclusion and equity. We'll go into some social identities. I'll break down intersectionality, or actually Kimberly Crenshaw will break that down so that you will hear from the expert that actually coined the term. We'll go into a little bit of implicit bias and how that is in policy. We'll talk about the equity lens, some action steps, and then we'll close with some Q&A. So that is our session for this evening. We'll keep it on track. So this first breakout will be about a 5-minute breakout, just getting our feet wet. And the questions you're going to focus on this evening are, do you have any apprehension about engaging in equity, diversity, and inclusion topics? For example, saying something that may offend, not feeling like you're allowed to be a part of the discussion, whatever other examples you all have. Maybe you're completely comfortable, you could share that as well. And then, have you engaged in policy work or advocacy work? If so, maybe share a little bit about some things that you are actively advocating in, or whatever policy work you have been a part of. So please feel free to be candid. And then when we come back as a group, I would love to hear from some of the folks that shared what you shared in your small groups. So Tracy, whenever you're ready, or whomever is going to bounce.
I'm going to open up the rooms now.
Awesome. Thank you.
Let's see. So Lisa, I saw you've been knocked off. So let's see. I'll put you in room. We've got 5 here and 5 here. I'll put you in room 2. Then you'll be with Danielle.
Okay, thanks. I missed the whole beginning.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
Are we going back?
That was quick, right? I'm sorry about that. At least I heard you. We'll follow up.
Hey, Donna.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Okay. Well, welcome back. I know that 5 minutes, it flies, right? But again, you're just dipping your toe in. I hope that folks were able to just kind of round robin and have some conversation. If I could hear from a couple of the groups that shared, first question, do you have any apprehension about engaging in EDI topics? What were some responses in that space?
I'll speak on that one, Danielle. My team, the ladies that were in our group, no, they didn't have a problem with engaging in those kind of conversations. It did come up that, initially, when we first began this journey with efficacy and diversity and talking about it, it was challenging to voice the opinions and then remain professional at the same time. But as time went on, I think we all agreed that we're at a place where we can agree, we can come to the table and have those conversations. It gets challenging in our personal lives talking. And now, because we're doing all this training in our professional lives and with our agencies and corporations that we work with, but our personal lives, it ranges. Everyone has an opinion, and it can get kind of challenging to share those opinions. But yeah, for the most part, everybody is open to talking and listening.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for jumping in there. Somebody else might want to add. You're from one other person on that first question. What'd your group talk about? Don't be shy, y'all. Lean in.
Hi, this is Alvi. I think we were in group 4.
Okay.
We didn't get to the advocacy one question, but we got to the first one. And I think there's a certain level of discomfort, perhaps, and apprehension might be more of a word that that we didn't really relate to as well, but more of being guarded, that so you don't offend others, because I know I have experience of somebody being offended unknowingly is because of what I said, without that intention, really. So I have learned my lessons to be more sensitive and be more guarded on the words that I say, in portraying something that is really no intention of any offensive note. And I think that was shared with most of us as well.
Thank you. Did any group get to the second question? Okay, if some folks that got to that second question, if you could share. Have you engaged in policy work or advocacy? Go ahead.
Yeah, I belong to the same group as LV. And I was the only one who was able to share because we only had 5 minutes. But so yeah, but it is just my own personal advocacy, but I do advocacy work and policy work. I do health and cancer prevention programs here in the AV, as well as tobacco control prevention programs.
Okay.
So those are my two major advocacies and policy works.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'll leave some space if one other person wants to share. If you didn't get a chance to answer the question and you want to answer it in this space, I open the floor for you to be able to do that. Okay, while you're doing the, start the countdown on the sharing, when I'm gonna start sharing my screen here in a second.
I didn't get a chance to share, but
Okay.
I just will share that, I think that people think it's politically correct to say that they've had this training, but to be honest and true, I think people are just checking boxes. An organization are checking boxes to say that they have an equitable person because they put a Black person on a flyer or Latinx on a flyer, or they employ some person to speak on behalf of equity or diversity on behalf of their organization. I mean, I may be one of the rebels in the community because I'm a co-chair of Council of Contract, and we're looking to, reimagine, care in schools and community. But I think that here in the Antelope Valley, we really need to look and see how we are underserved and how people of color are not being equitably treated all across the board. And these discussions need to happen, and people need to feel uncomfortable, and people need to be affected to make change. They've been sitting comfortably and being okay with the picture and the person checking the box. But the only way to be an advocate and an activist is to speak out against that. And hopefully even in this group, that we are honest and true and speak up and say what we really believe and what really needs to happen. Not so, cheerful and passive, but actually say something and educate people honestly, how we feel, what our needs are, what's not appropriate to say, and how we move forward. But I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Thank you. So you all have had an opportunity to share. And again, we'll continue to have open dialogue. And I agree, my hope is that you all continue to really lean into that discomfort and share, because in that space of discomfort is an opportunity for growth. Donna, I saw that you unmuted. Was that intentional? Did you want to share, or were you?
I was deciding, but since you didn't call me,
All right.
So I think a lot of the times, I think a lot of the times it is difficult, and it's not necessarily when you're discussing diversity with someone of an opposite diverse culture. I think people expect you to show up like they would show up. And where in this world, or at least in my life, my experience is there's all kinds of people everywhere. Okay. And Whereas even the people that are struggling with being diverse or not acknowledging, diversity in their worlds, they're still not all the same kind of person. So they still can't be approached the same kind of way. And so, what I found is that sometimes we look at people and we expect them to show up like we would show up. I mean, I had that same problem when the George Foreman protests were going on, and I was like, okay, so George Floyd. George Foreman. Oh my God, George Floyd. Okay, so when those protests, and I was like, oh my God, I'm looking at people and how they were expressing themselves, and then I had to realize, okay, well, there's space for everybody in this space. Okay, there's space for protesters. There's space for folks who are really angry. There's space for people that aren't necessarily angry and not necessarily angry out loud. But that are dealing with it other ways. And so I think in the space of being diverse, we have to be diverse even in our diversity, if that makes any sense.
It does. It does. Thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
I see a hand. Please correct me if I don't pronounce your name correctly. Day Yusuf.
Outstanding job. Thank you.
Okay.
So I guess I come from a different aspect with this because I happen to be a brown-skinned girl. However, my background is extremely diverse. So my mother is an Israelite. So she's a Middle Eastern, and my father is a Black Cherokee. So I think I get lost in between because people automatically look at me and assume what I am. And then because I think that I kind of play the middle ground where I can see both sides. And then I will get from those that feel like you should side with us. But I'm like, there shouldn't be a side. In my opinion, there shouldn't be a side. There should be, you can't give one race equality by taking it away from someone else. So I don't know. I try to stay, I don't feel apprehensive about speaking, period. However, in this Antelope Valley, I tend to draw back and choose not to speak because I'm reading the room. Because I'm not getting ready to be confrontational with you because your feelings are your feelings and my feelings are my feelings. And hence there draws the problem is everybody is so robust about their feelings, they're unwilling to give way to somebody else feeling a different way. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. So I see we're gonna have no problem with discussion today, which is exciting. I'm excited to hear from you all because from my vantage point, I have the opportunity to learn and grow from you all as well, right? We have a reciprocal space. So we'll move forward. Thank you for the engagement, and we'll have an opportunity to break out again. Now is the time where I'm just going to give you a little bit more of the technical information, right? I want to start us from a common language point. Oftentimes, we all have different definitions for words in this space. I want to utilize this kind of framework for our definitions as we engage during this time. So I've used a couple of acronyms already. I wanted to break those down. Sometimes you'll hear IND, inclusion and diversity, D&I, diversity and inclusion. Oftentimes we're seeing that E in there. That's that equity piece. So DEI, EDI, there's no shortage of ways to put it. The only advice that I will provide is if you put it in the name of your organization, or if you have someone with that title, they probably should be doing that work. Don't put words in a title or in your vision mission statement or in your marching orders that no one is actually doing. It's important to make sure that you're reflective of that, those particular terms that you're putting out there. Diversity is the unique range of human differences. I like to consider those things diversity facets. Some of those facets may include, but certainly not limited to, race, gender, religion, ethical value systems, nation of origin, political beliefs, veteran status, abilities, disabilities, right? There are no shortage of diversity facets. Oftentimes I hear folks say, we have no diversity here. There's no diversity in this space. By definition, diversity always exists, just by pure definition. Even if you're in a space that has all Asian people, all Black people, all white people, all atheists, the space is still diverse because the definition, right, of diversity is just human differences, the range of human differences. You may be lacking a facet of diversity. If you're a heavily male industry, you're lacking folks that identify maybe as women, maybe folks that identify as gender nonconforming, right? You might have some of those parts that are missing in your facet. Maybe you're a young talent pool and you're missing some of your more seasoned folks. But again, diversity always exists. Implicit bias, the theoretical term of implicit bias, sometimes you might have heard it as unconscious bias. Sometimes those terms are interchangeable, but implicit bias or implicit social cognition refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, which encompass both favorable, unfavorable assessments, are activated involuntarily and without individual awareness or intentional control. Sometimes we are, though, aware of those biases, and we start to question when we say implicit. There's a level of you might know a little bit of the bias that you have. It's just innate, it's natural. Inclusion is an involvement and empowerment where the inherent worth and dignity of all people are recognized and valued. A lot of times people say, oh, we're an inclusive environment, but if you ask the individuals in that space, they would say, no one's listened to me in years. Right, so that's really asking and going forth. It's one thing to listen, it's another thing to value and listen. So if I'm telling you something, if I want to shape policy, if I want to shape procedure, I know that when you come to me, you're not only going to hear me, but you're going to value what I've said, and then you're going to you're going to implement my words. So there's the difference, right? I can listen to you all day, but am I implementing you? Do I make you feel warm, welcome in this space? So ensuring that we really know what we mean when we say inclusion. Systemic, relating to or affecting the whole of a system. So organizations, culture is systemic. Many of you probably work in places where you know what the culture is, or you feel the culture. It's either welcoming or it's a not welcoming environment. You know that jeans day is on Friday, but on Monday, I can't wear that outfit, right? Some of those things in your culture are systemic. Systems affect the whole. So what is the system? Redlining was a systemic way to keep people from being able to access housing. So are folks familiar with the term redlining? Okay. Good. Lots of head nods. I'm from Wichita, Kansas. I'm in the Midwest. There's a lot of historical things that we have to continue to teach people, right? And that's across the country. But sometimes we talk about a group of people and we want to call them lazy and all these other things, but we don't know the systems and the history that put them there. So it's important for us to know those things before we talk about full groups. We got to know what systemically is holding folks back. What are those barriers? Equality, the same in quality, measure, esteem, or value, providing the same exact resources, treating everyone exactly the same. Equity refers to fairness and justice and is distinguished from equality. So where we think about equality is everyone's getting the same thing at the same time. Equity looks at that starting point. What are your needs? We're filling those needs. And it's easier for me to showcase it. I'm sure many of you all have seen all of these sort of photos and pictures, but this just helps to create a baseline for us to be able to talk about equality and equity. And this is a reflection moment. So I'm going to ask you all to reflect in the work that you're doing and what you're engaged in. Do you practice equality or are you practicing equity work? Or is it a little bit of both? So in that first photo, we see equality. Everyone has been given a box, regardless of their level to use the box. They all have received the same thing, the same type at the same time. They all have a box. The first gentleman really doesn't need the box. Standing on it gives him a little bit more of a leg up, but he didn't need it. The person in the middle probably needs another box, can barely see, but received a box nonetheless. And the third person is like, throw the whole thing away. What can I do with this box? That's equality. Okay, equity states that we're looking at your actual needs. We're assessing what is going to help you get to that next level. The first person, they're good, don't need a box. Second person is receiving 2 boxes so that they're stable and able to fully see. The third person is given a ramp. Right? This person is in a wheelchair. They need to be able to be on the ramp, to be able to utilize it, to be able to access the game like everyone else at the same time, same rate. Liberation or justice would be that fence wasn't there at all. So it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum. It doesn't matter your ability or disability. You'd be able to access the game at your level because there is no barrier in the first place. So as you think about how this shows up in your work, equality versus equity, what are you doing around that work? How often are you afforded the opportunity to really assess what people need? And can you give them what they need? Or is there a barrier? Is there a policy on the books that says, no, everybody gets the same thing, right? And sometimes we're hindered by policies. We want to provide equity, but our policies say, no, you have to work within an equality framework. Just some food for thought as we move this conversation forward. And then dimensions of diversity. I love this wheel. It just provides some more insight into some of the facets that I was sharing earlier when we think about those primary and secondary rings. These are the things that shape how you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? When you think about your race, your age, your national origin, your sexual orientation, right? Those are those internal things. You might call that your identity, your personality, however you identify with that. Then as you go out, there's intersections to that, right? So that external piece, that socioeconomic status, your geographical location, what diversity and inclusion looks like for Wichita, Kansas, probably looks different than the Antelope Valley or wherever you are in California, right? We have some major differences, even in our demographics, when we look at experiences, citizenship, right? Folks that are undocumented, folks that are immigrants. When we think about those particular experiences, DACA, deferred action on early childhood arrival, how does that show up in our spaces? Organizationally, where are you in the organization? Are you union affiliated? What's your seniority or tenure, right? Department, division, work location, those things kind of shape how we look diversity and inclusion and equity. And then era, world events, historical events, cultural events, political events. Over these last 2 years, we have had no shortage of historical events, right? When we think about maybe our young people today, I don't know if you all have family members or caregivers that have given you that I walked 20 miles to get to school, up the hill, up the mountain in the snow, right? Today's youth are going to say, I sat in front of a Zoom screen all day, right? Or they're going to be able to recall COVID from their vantage point and what it was like. Many of our children had to parent themselves because parents still had to work, right? While the world shut down, for some, it never did. They had to just keep going, right? So even thinking about our privileged vantage point and the type of housing that we're in. So these are some of those dimensions of diversity to consider when you are talking to someone, because we bring all of this to the forefront. A little bit about me. My mom is from Pampanga, Philippines. And then my dad is from Birmingham, Alabama. So I'm half Filipino, half Black. And those are two very different experiences. My mom has all of a 3rd grade education, worked incredibly hard, cleaning hotels, manufacturing, whatever she could do. One of the smartest women I know. And then my dad got his bachelor's degree from an HBCU, Dillard University in New Orleans. The HBCU is a historically Black college university. So I have lots of stuff going on, but I have the opportunity to be able to really understand the importance of education and being able to move forward. So as you all are being vulnerable, I'll make sure I sprinkle a little bit of my vulnerabilities too, so that we're continuing to have a robust dialogue. So we're going to go into another breakout session here pretty soon, but we're going to talk about social identities. And this is going to give you all an opportunity to talk a little bit more about those identities, because I want to set the tone before we really get into the meat and potatoes of this conversation. But social identity. So when we think about social identity theory, it comes from Henry Tefel, and they share it's a person's sense of who they are based on their group membership. And we all have these group memberships. Oftentimes you are, maybe you identify as a certain way, or maybe the world sees you as a certain way, and they put you in those boxes. So for example, for me, I'm a biracial woman. Oftentimes I say I'm a Black woman or I'm a woman of color. I don't ever really run around here saying I'm an Asian woman. I'm really not afforded that, because if I said that out loud, someone would be like, well, you don't look Asian, right? So putting that label on me that we can buy that you're a Black woman. We could buy that you're biracial, that you're a woman of color. We're trying to figure out what you are sometimes, depending on my hair, is usually the conversation. Curl, flat, braided, whatever it is, that's the guessing game. But I'm never just outwardly, oh, she's an Asian woman, she's a Filipino woman, right? So when we think about social identities in those boxes, and think about, just as a reflection before we go into those conversations, how often are you categorized as something that you don't even identify with? So thinking about that, or categorizing folks that we actually work with every day and we don't know how they identify. Tefel proposed that groups such as social class, family, football teams, really kind of showcase our source of pride, self-esteem, and belonging. It gives us that sense of the world. We like to make sense of things. That's how our brains are shaped. They want to we want to be able to label you this thing and call you that because it's easier. Our brain is easily wired to just put things in boxes, just makes it compartmentalized and easy. And when we do that, sometimes we divide the world into this us and them. It can be as extreme as Germany, when we think about the Jewish and those that are, and Hitler, right? And that Nazi regime, that was a very big difference on the us and them. But we also see it in the Black and white context, or sometimes in our Hispanic and Brown communities, right? This us and them attitude kind of shows up. So how are we mindful of that? And it's okay to have your social identities, but how often are we intersecting into the other spaces and understanding that we're all different things at all different times? You may be born into those identities. Maybe they're visible or invisible. They can change over time. And people have multiple identities. I believe that identities can be both a privilege and an oppression. I think we all experience privilege to some degree, and I think we all can experience oppression to some degree. Some groups experience it at a higher rate than others based on their placement and if you're a part of the majority or the minority. But it's important to kind of understand how power dynamics play out as well. And then social identities can be salient. They can change over time. I think 17 years ago, I wasn't thinking about being a parent, but now everything I do, I think about it from the lens of a caregiver. I'm a mom of 3 kids, right? And one for each generation, 17, 8, and 3. So a lot of my decisions are, man, I'm a caregiver. What am I doing? I have an aging set of parents, and I'm also a caregiver to a sister who has several mental illnesses. So with all those things going on, I'm always thinking, I have to think from a caregiver lens. So when we're thinking about those identities, how do you see the world? How does the world see you? And how are you interacting with the world? So in our next breakout room, you'll have about 10 minutes to really talk this through, but those questions that you are going to consider, you'll see this wheel. Consider how the various social identities have an impact on your access to resources and to people in positions of authority, ability to direct your own and other people's work, authority to make decisions, ability to influence through position or relationships. And you can choose any of the identities that you see here. So you are at the center of that wheel and you have all these identities. You have a racial, ethnic identity, social, economic class, gender, sexual orientation, age, national origin, first language, physical, emotional, developmental ability, religious or spirituality or affiliation. And maybe you don't see something on the wheel that you actually identify with, but I want you to choose 1 or 2 identities and talk about those identities through these questions. And not everyone needs to answer every question, but just think about you as a whole person and all of these kind of identities as those things are categorized, how you identify, how does that affect your ability to engage in this space? Resources, directing work, authority to make decisions. How do those identities show up in that space? Questions about this next breakout session on how to dialogue about this. Okay, about 10 minutes. We want to make sure that we can hear from everybody, so don't answer every single question, but we'll try to make sure that folks have an opportunity to share. Tracy, go ahead when you're ready. Right. Welcome back, folks. Give you all an opportunity, if I can hear maybe from 2 or 3 folks that engaged with this question, and we'll move along because I do have a quick video clip, but let me hear from a couple of folks on how you engaged with this question. I know for some it was not easy, but I would love to hear how you all dialogue.
I'm going to jump in just because I was talking when you switched over, but it's funny because we're all in some kind of cohort. There's some kind of area that we're in, and what we or what I decided was that it's just a trip, because 2 of the Hispanic speakers were like, they were having issues because
did I say that correctly? You know, am I speaking correctly? Okay, well, you know what? People who are born in America don't speak correctly, you know? And so there was a young person who said, you know, well, maybe, you know, because I'm the youngest one in the room, I'm not being received. Okay, well, I'm 60. And, you know, there's a point where people believe that older people are stupid. Okay, never mind that they've had 60 years of wisdom and experience, you know? And so, and then there's a Caucasian young lady, Terry, and she's like, okay, well, she's dealing with disadvantaged youth, and my guess is, because I know her group, is that she's dealing with Black and brown people. So she's in there, and she's like, okay, well, I'm dealing with people who don't look like me, so they're not actually receiving me. Well, you know what? Big newsflash, you know what I mean? And not to discount from her, but that's the exact same thing that the Black and brown people say. You know, we're in a space, and so it's interesting to me that all of that. It's like everything that you can find is flipped on its head. And if we could just learn to be tolerant of each other, just in general across the board, then all of this, diversity, inclusion, it would be a no-brainer.
All right, thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
2 other folks. Are willing to share their experience in this conversation. Anyone else willing to share? Y'all are just quiet in the groups. No one said nothing. You just looked at each other. Well, I don't think that's what happened, but I'll take it down to one other person. Oh, Tracy, I see. Or is this a sympathy conversation?
No, I just told Danielle, I said, this is a good group because they all have opinions and they'll voice them. And now look, nobody's talking.
Okay, I'll go.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so for me, this wasn't necessarily my experience, but it's an experience that I had because of the pandemic. So most of you know, I retired from Kaiser last year after 23 years. And I tried to really be instrumental in getting more, well, everybody, but making sure that I focused on a lot of Black people and their care within Kaiser, because I know that we have, we talk about the Tuskegee experiment a lot in our community. And I know that our older generations were kind of afraid when everything happened with COVID and the vaccine. So I've always wanted to make sure that our elderly people got the care that they needed, made sure that they reached out to their doctors, because I know that sometimes when you don't have doctors or nurses that look like you may not be so amped to go and get the care that you need. So I think I've made a difference because I have a lot more people that still call me, even though I'm retired, and ask for assistance, but we haven't had the best care. Okay. And I know that over the last 5 to 10 years, other healthcare providers, but definitely Kaiser has made an effort to put more diverse doctors and nurses on the payroll. So that's one of the issues that I've seen.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, and I think that's spot on, right? When we talk about systemic, right? People of color's relationship with healthcare systems, right? There are no shortage of historical things that we can point to that actually drives that distrust. And no matter your background, there are things that are there that we're all aware of that we can continue to perpetuate and pass down. And we think about equity even in those spaces, the social determinants of health. So thank you for that. I am going to share my screen again. Make sure everybody can see that. We're all good there. All right, now we're going to kind of step into intersectionality. I started with social identities because I wanted you all to kind of think about what those identities are, and then understanding that everything intersects, right? There are so many different ways you can identify, right? I'm an executive director, I'm a mom, I'm a young woman, I'm a woman of color, right? You might have a political affiliation. If you're a part of an organization, I'm a part of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. So there's all these little things that I can identify within my identity, right? I'm a college graduate, right? My mom would have several different identities on her wheel that she could speak to, but they all intersect. So I'm going to do, this is about a 5-minute clip, so bear with me, but Kimberly Crenshaw actually coined the term intersectionality. So a lot of folks run around here with the term, but don't realize where it came from. And she does a really great job of breaking down what intersectionality actually is. And so we'll debrief this after the video.
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma de Graffenried. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. She applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma de Graffenried was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. Heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, all of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
Right. So I really enjoy that clip because it makes it plain, right? When we see things out of just one lens and we don't look at how we intersect in some of these spaces, how when we look at discrimination, when we look at creating policies, what makes the most sense and how can we be more supportive and helpful in these spaces by understanding the populations that we are serving and how diverse populations, what the needs are. What are the needs of the populations that we're serving, and are we actually serving them? So when we think about implicit bias in policy, and I'll just quickly kind of go over what implicit bias is, and you all heard it in the beginning, in the intro, when we were going over the definition. In this space, implicit bias really just lives in our brain. There are these 4 parts of your brain. So your amygdala, your hippocampus, your temporal lobe, and your medial frontal cortex, right? These things work together in creating bias. Your amygdala is one of the oldest pieces of your brain. So that's where you get your fight, flight, or freeze. If I ran into your space right now, your brain's going to react whether you are ready to react or not, right? That's something that is innate in us. Your hippocampus forms the links in the brain where your information, your memories are processed. Your temporal lobe integrates the sounds and the words. And the medial frontal cortex is empathy, emotional responses, and rational thought. If you know anyone that has damage in those areas, then some of those parts of their brains are not functioning, right? Those that are in major car accidents or those that have had major brain trauma might not be able to integrate those sounds and words, right? So when we think about information, our mind is unconsciously processing information every second. I will open it up to you all. About how many pieces of information do you feel like your mind is processing per second? How many pieces of information is your mind processing unconsciously per second? And feel free to drop it in the chat. We'll give you all a couple of seconds. How many pieces of brain? And don't Google it, because somebody did that to me and I was like, you didn't know that answer. I'll actually give you the answer. Your brain is processing, okay, thank you, Kim, 100. Actually, it's 11 million pieces of information. Your brain per second processes 11 million pieces of information. Consciously, you're able to process about 40 or 50 pieces, consciously, right? So your brain is wired to make decisions for you. And if you're not paying attention, if you're multitasking, your mind goes to that automatic reset button. It's whatever it wants to do. Sometimes I feel like if I don't have a coffee and some food in me, I'm having a 10-piece day, right? It really depends. But when we think about how much our brain fills in for us, that is how bias innately creeps in, because it's got to make quick decisions. Your brain is wired for safety and all those things. But ultimately, when we think about what's going on unconsciously, we know there's some bias in there. So how do we mitigate it? How do we know? How are we aware of it? How many of you all have ever driven home and found yourself in your driveway and looked up and said, how did I even get in my garage or my driveway? Mm-hmm. You were on autopilot, right? Your brain took you there. That's bias. That's innate, right? That's how bias shows up. Just how you showed up in your driving or in your parking lot is how bias shows up for you. And it's important for us to understand that. So just another example. So we'll kind of go over this scene. A middle-aged manager and her new employee. This is when we talked about bias earlier. Some of us provided some individual examples, but here's some institutional examples to kind of go off of the video we just saw. A middle-aged manager and her new employee, a young woman just out of college, approach an information booth in a Midwestern city. The manager, highly educated, fashionably dressed, and Hispanic, asked the woman behind the counter for directions. Rather than giving the rather complex directions to the Hispanic executive who just asked, the white woman behind the counter addresses only the new employee, who is also white. It happens all the time, says the executive, as the two walk away. She suggests that the woman in the information booth probably didn't even realize she was behaving in a subtly biased manner. For her part, the young white woman is too embarrassed to admit that she barely took note of what happened until her new boss pointed it out. How many of you all have ever experienced that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see a hand. Donna, did you raise your hand?
I was just saying that, yes, I had
Okay.
experienced that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. No, but right, many of us probably have experienced that, and again, even those that identify as white or Caucasian probably have experienced some form of bias, right? Bias happens to everyone. We just went through a quick kind of synopsis of what bias is. I shared most recently, I'm the executive director for Wichita Habitat for Humanity. We're engaged in affordable housing. We build homes alongside folks that want to become homeowners, right? For a quick kind of synopsis of what that is. You all probably have a habitat in you all's community or somewhere in California. There's several affiliates, and we have about 17 in Kansas alone. And so oftentimes when I'm on the build site, I live in a predominantly white community, predominantly white city. There's no surprise there. I'm in Wichita, Kansas. People of color make a smaller portion up in this particular city. But when I'm on the job site, sometimes folks think that I am the homeowner. I'm the person that's getting the home. They don't oftentimes think that I am the executive director of the organization. I don't take offense to it, but when you've not seen folks of color in leadership, if you've not seen a young person in leadership, right, those intersections, you might have a thought. And then if you've seen some of our homeowners, we skew more to supporting people of color, immigrants, are often those that are within our program. So these are some things that come up. So when we think about bias, implicit bias is usually thought to affect individual behavior, but it can also influence institutional practices or structures, right? Systems and structures are made of people. People have bias. For example, many institutions adhere to certain practices that disadvantage a subset of the institution's members, such as, so in this case, if you're at a university, maybe that university is holding faculty meetings at a time when parents are most likely to be picking up children at daycare, which discriminates against parents of young children, right? Or folks that need to be a little bit more flexible caregivers, if you will. Institutional bias is usually not deliberate. And when we think about schedules, for example, were often established at a time when most faculty were men married to women who stayed home with children. Thus, it is important to consider how past biases and current lack of awareness might make an institution unfriendly to members of certain demographics and groups. This is why it's important to look at your policies and when they were made, and how often, annually you should be looking at your policies, because if we're looking at policies on the books, when our earlier years, there was a certain type of person that worked in that space. And so we created policies that made sense for them. And as we diversify, right, many of us work in multi-generational companies where there's more than 5 generations working in that company, from the traditionalists to the Gen Z. So how are we accommodating the different types of people in our workforce? And how are we looking at things from that lens? Donna.
So now actually I do have my hand up. So this is an issue that there's so many types of things to deal with. I don't understand how my daughter, she's like 32, right? So I think it's that age range. She picks up all of this. She picks up diversity. Now, of course, she's skewed towards African Americans, but the point is she picks up all inequalities everywhere. I don't understand how she walks, how she's, how do you, I don't understand how you exist in a place where you have to rethink and think and rethink every situation and every movement that you make. It's almost like you would be, when you overload your computer and so it just won't work. Okay. It's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I hear you, right? And I think it's the lens that we look at it from, right? Nothing stays the same. I mean, some things stay the same, but we're always growing and evolving. Language changes, things ebb and flow, and it's how we take the time to lean in and learn it. It's like anything else, right? I want to be a really good executive director in housing, but some of these policies are changing all the time. So how do I make sure that I'm paying attention to what's happening at the local level, the regional level, the national level, what's happening in the global level? So that's no different. But it's how we're being introduced and how we're engaging with it and taking it one piece at a time. No one expects anyone, and maybe there's some folks out there, but I don't expect anyone to be totally culturally competent. There's no way. I don't know anyone that's fully competent, but I can have cultural humility and have a willingness and opportunity to be a lifelong learner. And especially if you're in diversity and inclusion work, right? Because there are so many types of cultures and people, but it's an opportunity for us to continue to really learn and grow and have radical empathy, if you will. Sometimes I don't understand. Sometimes I just got to empathize with you. That's what I can give, is the power of empathy. So I appreciate your comments there, Don. It does. I mean, as a practitioner of the work, sometimes I'm like, ooh, I got to learn that too. So yeah, providing that level of grace as well. So as we lean into the equity lens, and just in this space as a common language, equity lens is the intentional inclusion in decision and policy making, the focus on both the process and the outcome. And an equity lens oftentimes centers underserved or marginalized populations. And you have to be okay with that too. In the classroom, if you're saying that African-American boys are not reading at the same level as everybody else, and that means I'm going to spend a little bit more time with the group that's struggling, and everyone else is going to work with the teacher at the front of the room. If we're saying our undocumented students, our first generation students need a little bit more support, then my dollars and some of that stuff is going to be targeted towards the group that needs the most support, because when you work with the group that needs the most support, it lifts everybody up. And being okay with how we look at the shift of those resources, those dollars, and having the data to back that up too, right? Oftentimes we talk in anecdotes. We think that this group is not doing well, but it's really our population with disabilities across racial and ethnic background that need the most support, right? So how are we looking at it from an equity lens? And some questions to help you think through this when you're going through issues or you're thinking through policies, just some questions to consider through that equity lens. Your social political landscape, what's going on during the time frame of your issue? What are the equity issues in this issue? What needs to be addressed or considered? What does the larger historical and socio-political context, how does that affect this issue? And how do people experience the issue? Right, so whatever the issue is, and maybe you have an issue in your mind, maybe take some time to reflect and put an issue in your mind, and we'll work through this equity lens model. Right now in Kansas, we're working through, our legislators are trying to say that we want to make sure we ban critical race theory. That's something on the legislative agenda. We don't want folks learning about slavery and just, for keynote, critical race theory is not whatever your legislators are saying. 9 times out of 10, I promise you it's not, right? Elementary schools, K through 12, they're not teaching critical race theory. Kimberly Crenshaw teaches critical race theory. They're teaching Martin Luther King, K through 12, right? There's a theory and practice, and then this is diversity education. And really diversity education, a lot of those things are under attack at this point. I'm assuming it might be the same for you all in whatever spaces that you are in. But we'll take an issue and polarize it and make it a community issue, right? So what's the historical or the political landscape going on with your issue? What's the personal lens? So how might your own intersectional social identities and biases affect how you are seeing the issue? Are you a part of the population that is experiencing the issue? Are you not a part of the population? Are you someone that's actually producing the issue or upholding the systemic issue? So how does that show up and how is that affecting you? How might others' intersectional social identities and biases affect how they are seeing the issue and impacting the issue, right? For when I think about immigration, right, I have a different intersection to that issue. My mom is not a citizen. She's still a citizen of the Philippines, but she came over and she has an alien card. So for her, she has a different viewpoint of immigration versus someone else that maybe came over undocumented versus someone else that has deferred action on early childhood arrival. So how do these different groups think about immigration and the policies and the laws? How can they attain citizenship? And what do they actually think about it? The population that's affected by the policy or the law that's on the books. Read the room, which is one of my favorites. Whose voices and experiences are being included or highlighted? Are the people being impacted included in the decision-making process? How often do we make decisions for groups of people and we don't know what they want? We're saying, oh, they want access to pools. Do they want access to pools? They don't want to pay no taxes. Do they not want to pay no taxes? I mean, like, what did we talk? Who did you talk to when you made the assumption or the policy? Did you talk to any of those folks? Do we want to have the meeting at 5 o'clock, or can the caretakers come to the meeting at 5 o'clock? Right. So when we're making decisions for these groups, are we talking to the impacted groups themselves? Are their voices and perspectives being heard? And do they have power? Because the other thing is, we'll go into communities and we're knocking doors and we're trying to listen, but they're like, you came here 4 years ago and this street still hasn't changed. I'm tired of talking to you. Every time you come around, you have questions. It's time. Oh, it's time to vote. You're at the front of my church speaking to the congregation, and then we don't see you again till the next 4 years. But my community, my 15-minute walkable community has not changed. I don't have the sidewalk that you promised me. Right. So how are we engaging in that space? What power dynamics are at play in the process of decision making or addressing the situation? And when I think about our K through 12 situations here, it's easy for our legislatures to cut school funding when they don't have any kids in schools, in public schools. They're not proximate to the issue because they don't have to face the issue. So what do your lawmakers look like? Are they reflective of your community? 9 times out of 10, a lot of times they're not. And if they're not, it makes it even worse. It makes you feel like you're certainly not heard at all. Whose cultural norms, values, and standards and perspectives are reflective in the process and the actions of the decision making? Who's ever in power is who benefits from the policy that's made, generally. And sometimes you'll get someone, a minority in a space, but again, we'll also lean on that minority and think that they're going to be the savior. They have no power either. They need 4 folks to vote alongside them. So that one vote that they casted against the whole thing and the whole thing still passed, they really don't have the power to make the change because they're not a part of the majority in that space. So understanding what those power dynamics are, who's on your boards, who's at that leadership level to make those decisions. And do folks have time to be in those spaces? I feel like I saw a hand go up. Donna, go ahead.
Okay, it's me again. Yeah. So one more to your list though is, are you engaging? Because like to your question, do you have the power? Well, you do have the power, but are you using it? So you're waiting for that person to knock on your door and ask you a question, or are you calling your legislators and telling them what you feel?
Yeah. Right. It's both and. How often are we reaching out? And also, right, an added fact to that, I think, for those folks that have the privilege to engage, that have the time to engage, right? Because we sometimes don't have folks that have the time when you're working 2 and 3 jobs because you don't make a livable wage, because the system won't pay you a livable wage, and you don't have childcare because childcare is too expensive. You can't make the school board meeting to voice your issue. Right. So those are all the things, but who can show up? Who are the folks that we can engage with that can carry your message? Maybe it's not you, but who are you connected to? And then impact. How might this action, decision, service, or policy affect people with different social identities differently? Does this action increase a sense of belonging and access to resources, opportunities, and power to people from underrepresented or marginalized groups? How might this action unintentionally advantage people from dominant groups and disadvantage people from underrepresented or marginalized groups? And what are some ways to ensure equitable impact or outcomes, right? How can you ensure that the changes are sustained as well? So these are some questions to consider as you're making decisions, as you're doing the work. How often are we really bringing these questions to bear in these spaces and working with the groups that we're making the decisions on behalf of, and hearing their voices and understanding what resources need to be there for folks to be successful? So some action steps as we kind of come to the latter part of the presentation this evening: bias mitigation, counteracting, setting the expectation, and what I like to say is cultural humility. So what is bias mitigation? So when we think about our institutional policies and practices, many institutional policies were developed when the workforce looked totally different, right? When we even think about our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, right? Who were considered full people at the time? We have residue of policies that are systemic, and we have supremacist practices oftentimes in the spaces that we're in. There's those power dynamics that hold people back. So when we think about the workforce today and small policy changes, those can make large effects on our work for success. Promotion timelines that conflict with women's prime childbearing years, certain interview practices, traditions that require attendance at institutional functions or religious holidays, lack of dedicated space for lactating women. How many of you had to breastfeed on the go? I was in restaurant when I had my first child, and there was no space for me to simply pump, right, in that space. So even thinking about those types of accesses, bias criteria for hiring or performance reviews, creating an institution that is unwelcoming to women, people of color, people of certain sexual orientations, caregivers who are physically challenged, or people of certain religions, reviewing practices and policies with bias in mind can identify those that could be disadvantaged from some of these communities. So how are we looking at our commitments to the groups that we're working with? And do we have policies and practices in place that actually support versus creating these unintended barriers or these hindrances? And even a policy with good intentions can create these issues. So just really thinking about the groups that we're serving. When we think about that counteract piece, assess your biases, know where they come from, who taught you them, how do they pass down, and really lean into the bias. We have these beliefs, but you have to dig in and drill. Why do I believe this? And then is it even factual? Oftentimes we'll run with something that we heard because our mom's mom taught us, and we just pass it on down like a recipe. But some of these biases we don't need to pass down any longer. Deconstruct and relearn. Make sure you understand the groups that you call yourself an ally or an advocate for. Are you educated about those populations? Do you speak their language? Do they see you as an advocate or an ally? Because we'll be quick to say, oh, I'm an advocate for the LGBTQ plus community, but they've never seen you. They don't know you to be their advocate or ally. I oftentimes have people say, I'm looking for diversity for my board. Can you give me a couple of names of African Americans? And then I'll say, or Hispanics or Latinx. We need someone bilingual. We need someone that does ASL. How often are you showing up in their community? Before you ask them to show up for you, how often did you show up for them? And then if that same person comes to me 4 and 5 times asking for diverse populations, I'm asking, are you not proximate yet? Do you just ask them to serve and then you've not built a relationship or an inroad for yourself? I'm happy to provide the initial first or second time. The third, fourth, and fifth, I'm asking, how proximate are you to the diversity that you're seeking? Review your policies and procedures. When were they last updated? Is the policy needed for, I'm sure you all are like we are, labor shortage is a thing. And we're starting to see schools say, you know what, substitute teachers don't need 1 million degrees. We just need you to be 18, got a couple of hours under your belt. We need you to teach the babies, right? You don't need a doctoral degree any longer. This is a teachable resource, right? So do you need the certificate? Do you need a degree? Or can I teach you what you need to know so that you can be successful in this space? We want our incarcerated populations to thrive. We got to give them jobs and livable wages, right? They've served their time, ban the box. Now there's some things that you can't, that some folks can't work in some spaces, right? But how do we expect folks to be able to get back in the workforce when we have unattainable goals, right? When we think about those things, audit your print, marketing, and website material. Who's on your website? Is it friendly? But also, don't bait and switch. Don't put the multicultural photos on the on the website and the pamphlet, and then the person gets there and there's like, oh, there's 2 of us? Or where is it? Where all these folks are having fun on the pamphlet, but there's no one here. And we're not willing to educate or hold folks accountable when I get there. And learn the language, pronouns, first people language, understand how your community is referring to each other and talking to each other, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, in-group, out-group dynamics. I love Kevin Hart jokes, but they're not appropriate in every space. So I probably shouldn't use them in the board meeting. So just thinking about your own presence, time, place, and space. How am I talking? How am I showing up? What language am I using? Set the expectation. When we think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, it starts at recruitment. And the efforts are showcased and tracked in your retention. If you can get them in the door, you should be able to retain them. If you get them in the door and they leave, you have a culture problem. What's the culture? If you're seeing all types of people leave, why? Read those exit interviews. What's going on? Is there certain people? Are there policies? What is keeping me from keeping people engaged in my organization, my workforce, whatever that looks like? And then when we're thinking about the reflection of the community, do you want to be reflective of your city, your state, your region, right? We all have access to census data. So maybe you're trying to be reflective of the census data, right? Do you have folks that are bilingual? Do you have folks that speak Vietnamese? Are you ensuring that you have the people to interact and engage with the community that you're working alongside? And then, right, continuing with benefits, flexible time, professional development, affinity groups if need be. There are all these different ways to try to keep people in spaces or create synergy or familial connections, upward mobility opportunities, training, mentorship matches. Those are different ways to consider how you engage with the populations that you're serving with. And then cultural humility, right? Taking that lifelong commitment to learning and critical self-reflection. Know your background. There's no such thing as I'm just white. No, you come from something, right? I'm just Black. You come from a historical line. Some of us have the privilege to look through years and years of ancestry.com history, while others of us don't have access because our stuff was systemically burned down to the ground. And I don't know what tribe I came from. Right? As a Native Indigenous person, you might not know or have the access or the ability. Maybe you're in foster care and you bounced around and never even knew your biological family. So if you have the privilege to understand your lineage, I implore you to learn it, learn your background and pass that information down, because not all of us have the opportunity to have access to that type of information. Desire to fix power imbalances within your provider-client dynamic. There's a power dynamic. How are you showing up? Maybe the people you're serving don't want to talk to you because you're coming in too hard. You're coming in a little strong, right? You're preaching to someone that has worked all day and now they kind of come sit and listen to you, right? And you're not being empathetic. So how are we showing up, right? Are you showing up with the appropriate, graceful, gracious attitude to connect with those that need support? Sometimes folks just want to be heard. And sometimes it's just a, girl. And you're just listening. You have nothing to give them that day. Maybe they just need to eat first. They need something on their belly before they're even ready to engage with you. So sometimes there's a little bit of budget for food in the space, right? Sometimes eat, then talk, because they've been running all day. And then institutional accountability and mutual respectful partnerships based on trust. So how does that show up in your space as we're continuing to do the work? So I want to pause right now because I kind of ran through some things on this equity lens. And I just want to reflect and check in. Are there things that resonated? Are there things that are like, no, Danielle, that sounds off. I don't agree with that. And I'm good with that too. Anything we're missing?
So Danielle, I was listening to everything you said and it brought something up for me. I spent about 8 years as the Kaiser Permanente's the president of Kaiser's African American Association. And I remember one time I did an event and I asked all of the other groups to participate. So we had the Asian Island Pacificers, Black folks, the Hispanic group. And I remember as we were preparing, it took like 2 weeks. And as we were preparing for the next day event, I had 3 Caucasian ladies come up to me and say, well, we felt like we weren't a part of it. And I'm like, what do you mean? We've been doing this for weeks. You know, how are you not a part of it? And so we realized that they were upset because they couldn't figure out what being American was. And I'm like, so we had like our cultural food. We had people that brought in like wigs, the afros from back in the day. And, you know, every group had their things. We even had the Native Americans brought the headdress, but they didn't know what their thing was. And they were really upset. They wanted us to cancel the whole event that we worked so hard on. And, you know, it's interesting because this was many years ago, probably like about 17 years ago. And I'm like, they're like, well, what do we do? And I'm like, well, I don't know what to tell you. We're all Americans, so
Right.
I mean, I don't know what your thing is. And then, you know, being funny, I was like, well, just bring apple pie and hot dogs and baseball, something regarding baseball. And that's literally what they did. And I'm like, okay, because I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, now I understand. And nobody's from here unless you're Native American. So it's like, where are you from? I know that now, but I was like literally dumbfounded. And we had to go to our vice president and say, they want us to cancel this event. And she was like, no, you have to figure out what you want to bring to the table. They're not going to cancel it. So I just really found that interesting. So when you were saying that, about people who don't know their origin, where they're from and everything, I was like, yeah, it brought me back to that incident. So thank you for sharing that. So it showed me how much I've grown also through the years. So thank you.
No, I appreciate you sharing that. And that's true, right? When folks have to think about, oh, what do I bring? Who am I is the question. Who am I? Where am I from? And when you can be connected to that, you can have a little bit more robust experience. Juanette, am I saying your name right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
It's funny when you said that, Sylvia, because I used to do the Miss Black Antelope Valley and the Miss Latina AV, and I got hundreds of threats that I was a racist for doing that. And why can't we have a Miss White pageant and all kinds of stuff. Even the sheriff contacted me for a death threat about pageantry. And I did it because African Americans and then Latinx young ladies were trying out for the variety of community pageants, but they were never being selected. And so it's important for little girls of every color to see girls representing them in community. So that's why I established it, and it had other things that went with it in regarding, you know, being engaged and etiquette and, you know, education or whatever. But it's like, even when we try to do things for our own race, we're racist for doing that. But when we go to what exists, we're not welcome, appreciated, valued, or even chosen, you know. So it's a catch-22 forever. You know, when is it okay that we help our own and mentor our own and educate our own without being chastised or considered racist when we help? But they don't look at it the other way. Like they're saying, you should call the event off because we don't see how we fit. Well, we don't fit anywhere. We keep trying to, you know? So that's a problem. And in our community, I want people to leave, you know, this conversation by, like they say, looking through other lenses, is that when you get ready to speak that, just think, you know, about others and other people of color and race and gender and like all of the pronouns that exist, that, you know, they have a right as well. And we just need to be thoughtful in making those selections and choices and wording when we move forward.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And I see that all the time, right? Campuses. So when I worked at Wichita State University, I was over the African American Faculty and Staff Association. And folks would say, well, why don't we have a white association? And I would say, well, that's called Wichita State University.
Right. That's right. You got one.
Because the numbers, let's look at the data, let's look at the numbers. I'm not going to argue with you emotionally. Let's just look at the data. We're on a predominantly white institution. That's not a bad thing. That's just what the numbers say. So on a campus that's 70% white and African Americans, Black folks make up 5%, we're going to have an African American and Faculty Staff Association. So we can have, right, there's no community is monolithic. We have different experiences, but there's an opportunity for folks to have those affinity groups, folks that might share some cultural similarities, but you can't just live in that space. Like you can't just live in a space that's just purely segregated. So there's opportunities for us to be able to engage amongst each other, but it shouldn't be a threat. I often ask, how often are you the only one in the room? When you think about your identities, how often are you the youngest? How often are you the oldest? How often are you the out atheist or the out LGBTQ plus person? Whatever, however you identify, how often is it just you? And then my majority folks in the room, if you're always in the majority, and depending on where you're at, in some spaces, so when we go to Missouri, on the Kansas City and Missouri side, there's a higher level of African American population. So in that space, and higher levels of Hispanic population. So there's students in high schools with people that have similar cultural backgrounds. And then when they come to Wichita, Kansas, they're like, whoa, culture shock. I'm not used to being in a space that has so many white people in it, or so many Asians in it, or so many this or that, right? So just being mindful of those cultural opportunities and those opportunities to intersect. Because, you know, what we know is diversity and inclusion isn't all about race and ethnicity or gender. We have those conversations, and those are the things that easily pop up the most. But there are other pieces to that, right? If we're all going out to eat and I'm a big meat eater and the vegan comes along and there's nothing on the menu, we ain't thought about them, right? We didn't include the vegan, the vegetarian, or the person that doesn't eat pork, right? So it's really this kind of holistic way of thinking. So for this personal impact statement, as we wind down, this is just personal work for you. How will this session inform my policy and advocacy work moving forward? What am I committed to doing to impact change with what I've learned? And what must I do to succeed in my commitment? My hope is that you kind of spend some time answering those questions for yourself, and then revisit that 3 months down the line. What process or progress have you made? 6 months, a year from now? How are you really utilizing everything that you've learned in this series to make you a better provider in whatever it is you're doing? But you have an opportunity to really put some goals in place and bring stuff. If you are the leadership to make the decisions, you can put this in place yourself, or you can be the influencer that brings it to folks to be able to consider this equity lens and ways of doing things. And I always love a good quote. So I want to end with this one with Audre Lorde. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives. All of these things intersect. And if we understand the intersection, we can really look at the whole issue. If we understand the history of an issue before we make a determination, or what's going on in the political, social nature of the issue, and really dig into it, we can create some positive changes. But it takes a while, right? And it takes a while for policies to change. So it's certainly a journey. It's not an easy one. But this work is long. Advocacy work is years long work, because it took years to build the system that was created to do what it was supposed to do. It's not broken. It's created to disenfranchise. So how do we break it back down and rebuild it in a more equitable way? Some resources, and I'll make sure that I get this over to Tracy so she can share some of these options for you to look at, some things that are out there, some different tools, looking at an equity lens for yourselves, for your nonprofits, your organizations, advocacy work, what have you. My contact information, happy to continue to work alongside you all and have discussions. And I will stop now if there's questions or things that I may have missed.
Do we have any questions? Also, if you don't want to take yourself off mute, you can always put it in the chat. And as always, wanted to thank Danielle very much for spending today with us. If we can give her a virtual round of applause or an actual physical round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And as always, I'm just going to take 1 more minute of your time, quick. Final thoughts as we end tonight. Final thoughts, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We're also going to put our link tree into the chat. As always, you'll be getting this video, so you'll have Danielle and her presentation to share as you like, and so we'll be sending that to you. Finally, next week, which is our last module, I cannot believe it's happened already. Our last module next week will be a living legend in California, Miss Dolores Huerta, and she will be speaking. Yeah, super excited. She's
send me that link. I'm interested. Send me that link. I need that.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people. Yeah, it's very exciting. So she'll be speaking on civic engagement. And finally, just so you can mark your calendars, but don't worry, I'll be sending you out. We will be going dark after Dolores. So that next week, in 2 weeks, it'll be dark, March 15th. But March 22nd, please do mark your calendars. That's going to be our last meeting. And it's very important because we're going to recap. We're going to take a survey. If I didn't share with you already, we already have 23 people signed up for our second cohort starting in August. And your feedback is going to be really, really important. We want to hear from you. We want to know which speakers you enjoyed, which speakers, maybe weren't up to par. So, that's really important. And we're also going to give you a little gift. So I'm not, trying to sweeten the deal, but we are going to give you a little something. And so we really, that's a really important date as well, March 22nd. And then finally, as I always say, today is Tuesday and you could be doing many other things, but you're sharing, and there goes my cat meowing. You're sharing your Tuesday with us, and we really, really appreciate it. So thank you so much. We will see you for the final speaker, which is next week, and that will be March 8th. And that will be Ms. Dolores Huerta. So super excited. Thank you again, Danielle. And thank you everyone for spending your Tuesday with us. We really, really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you.
And see you next week.